You know that feeling when something that seemed unshakable suddenly falls apart? That pain of seeing something great get lost? Well, for centuries, Rome was the ultimate symbol of power and order, an empire that seemed made to last forever. But then, they came out of nowhere, and terror spread, shaking the foundations of everything that was known. Today, we will learn the story of terror of Rome, how barbarians shook the empire, and you will discover not only what really happened, but also how fragile the strength of an empire can be when least expected. Get ready to see history like never before. Let's embark on a journey through time together. Forget the Rome you see in history books, all in ruins and full of tourists. I want you to imagine real Rome, the one that was a giant pulsating life and power in every corner. Think of a city so colossal that it was the center of the known world, where emperors with a simple wave decided the fate of millions of lives. Where Roman legions, famous for their discipline and strength, crossed entire continents, carrying the word of Rome to distant lands, where in fact the world revolved around their orders. But now, make an effort and imagine that same Rome, the powerful, the unshakable, looted, raped, reduced to a handful of ashes and a frightening silence. It hurts just to think about it, doesn't it? The fall of Rome was not a bolt from the blue, nor a battle lost in a single day. No, it was something much more insidious, a slow, hand-corrosive process, like a silent disease that saps your strength from within. It was a web of wrong decisions, internal betrayals that corroded the social fabric, and external forces that Rome, in its arrogance, simply ignored. In this chat, we will unravel this story. We will walk through this collapse step by step, unfolding the events like an ancient map. You will discover who these so-called barbarians and understand why they were just the last piece of a domino that had been falling for centuries. Because deep down, every ruin has a beginning, and Rome's, believe me, began precisely when it was at its highest point, in height of its glory, when Rome was queen of the world. Think about 1st century after Christ. Rome shone like never before. Under the command of emperors like Augustus, Vespasian, and Trajan, the empire reached an expansion that defied imagination. From the frozen forests of Britannia, modern England, to the burning sands of Arabia, from the wild banks of the Rhine, to the mystical heart of Mesopotamia. It was a colossus of almost 5 million square kilometers, with a population of over 60 million people. Put that into perspective, 1 in 4 human beings at that time lived under the rule of the Roman eagles, an unquestionable power. To famous Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was not just a pretty name. It ensured 2 centuries of relative stability and prosperity. Imagine paved roads connecting cities across thousands of miles, allowing goods, ideas, and people to flow freely. Giant aqueducts bringing fresh, clean water to arid regions, transforming deserts into oases. Roman laws, Roman currency, the Latin language, and imposing architecture created a common identity, a sense of belonging that united such diverse peoples. The legions, ever vigilant, maintained order with an iron fist, and trade flourished as never before. From the outside, it seemed that everything worked perfectly, like a well-oiled machine. But behind this facade of order and power, something was already beginning to change. Ranger to crack, the giant that grew too big and the silent hemorrhage. The crucial problem was that the empire had become too big. Think about it. Each new province conquered meant the need for more soldiers to protect it, more administrators to govern it, more resources to maintain it. It was a burden that grew exponentially. What about the Roman economy? It was a system that depended on large rural properties supported by slave labor. The great economic engine of Rome was conquest, which brought a constant flow of new slaves to work these lands. But when the conquest ceased, the flow of slaves dried up, and without new hands to work, the productive base, the pillar of the Roman economy, began to slowly wither away. The empire, which had grown and prospered on the basis of wars and expansion, began to self-destruct when this expansion stopped. To make up for the losses and keep the empire running, the tax pressure, taxes, increased dramatically. The free population, the one that was not slave, was becoming visibly poorer. The cost of maintaining the gigantic state machine, the armies, the bureaucracy, the public works, far exceeded the state's capacity to collect. Year after year, the deficit grew. From the 2nd century onwards, Rome began to suffer what I call a silent hunger. It was not hunger for food, but a hunger for currency, for economic oxygen. The trade routes that had once supplied Rome with exotic goods from India, Africa, and the interior of Europe began to break down. Constant border wars, the rise of piracy and general instability made transportation difficult. Everything became more expensive, much more expensive. Without constant tribute from the more distant provinces, and without new conquests to finance expenses, Rome entered a collapso fiscal monumental. Money turned to paper and trust disappeared. In an attempt to maintain the armies and public works, because after all, the empire couldn't stop, right? The Roman state began to do something desperate. Adulterate your coins. They put in less gold and silver and more copper. What happened? The currency lost value. The inflation has soared. Imagine, a bag of wheat that cost X today could double in price in a matter of weeks. Confidence in the monetary system, which is the basis of any economy, it disappeared. Nobody knew what was worth what anymore. And do you know who paid the highest price? The small landowners, artisans, and peasants. They were the backbone of society, but the burden of taxes and the devaluation of the currency crushed them. Many could no longer hold on to their land and were forced to abandon it. It was an unprecedented crisis. A new world is born, the seeds of feudalism. It was in this scenario of despair that a new model of life began to emerge. Thousands of people, seeking a minimum of protection and security, began to seek refuge, submit voluntarily to the great landowners. They offered their produce and labor in exchange for shelter and, crucially, protection from wandering soldiers, abusive tax collectors, or simply bandits. This model of direct dependence, where the peasant worked for the lord in exchange for shelter and protection, was the embryo of what centuries later would become feudalism. The root of it all lay there, in the failure of a Roman state that proved incapable of guaranteeing the basics, justice, security, or even the sustenance of its own population. The economic collapse not only weakened Rome, but planted the seeds of a new order, an order born of sheer desperation, the musical chairs of power, military anarchy. And if the economy was quietly collapsing, Roman politics, that made a lot of noise. From 235 AD onwards, the empire entered a period that historians themselves to describe the chaos called military anarchy. It's breathtaking. In just 49 years, more than 20 emperors ascended the throne, and most of them, they were assassinated, deposed, or killed in combat. Imagine the instability. Power was a deadly game where the crown was a target on the back. So, what do you think happened to this giant Rome, now sick inside and at war with itself? Could it rise again after so much turmoil? It was serious, my friends. Imagine the scene. No government was stable, no throne was secure. It was a macabre dance for power. Generals, once respected for their victorious campaigns, were now proclaimed emperors by their own troops, right there in the middle of the battlefield. And the worst part? Wars, which had previously been fought against external enemies, were now turned to inside Rome. Era legion against legion, province against province. Think of the chaos. Every corner of the empire was trying to impose its own will, and the so-called unity of Rome, which seemed unshakable, was falling apart from within, like an ancient fabric that frays until it turns to dust. And while this internal fight was boiling, do you know what happened? Borders were left unprotected. The Roman armies, which were supposed to be guarding the empire, were too busy fighting civil wars. This was the perfect opening. Germanic tribes, previously contained, were crossing the Rhine River without asking permission. The Sarmatians were invading Pannonia, a region that is now part of Hungary, and armed bands were laying waste to entire towns and cities. Cities that had once been symbols of security were now at the mercy of anyone. The poor people began to fear both foreign enemies and their own soldiers, who plundered Roman towns and cities as if they were in foreign lands. The historian Zosimus, who lived through this period, described the period in a way that makes your throat clench. He said that Rome seemed to be devouring itself, and believe me, he wasn't exaggerating. The emperor's authority, once sacred and unquestionable, was now fought over as a mere prize, a spoil of war. Power ceased to be a symbol of order, a beacon of stability, and became a trophy for whoever had the most strength or the most luck in palace intrigues. To survive this absolute chaos, Rome urgently needed to reinvent itself. And the first attempt, drastic and desperate, was to divide the empire in two. Two Romes, two destinies, the beginning of the end for one side. In 285 AD, a visionary, or perhaps just pragmatic emperor, named Diocletian, had an idea that would change everything. He instituted the Tetrarchia. Imagine a government with four heads, two main emperors called Augustus, and two vice-emperors, the Caesars. Each would be responsible for a specific part of the empire. In practice, Rome ceased to be a unified empire and began to function as two distinct worlds, East and West. The logic behind this division was, in theory, ingenious. Each half would deal with its own crises, have its own armies and its own capitals. It was thought that this would make administration more efficient and defense more robust. However, this separation, while useful in the short term to contain chaos, created irreversible fracture. It was like splitting a rock in half. And here is the big difference, the crucial point that would seal the fate of one side and consolidate the other. The Eastern Roman Empire, with its vibrant urban centers such as Antioch, Nicomedia, and later majestic Constantinople, ways economically stronger and more stable. Think of more lucrative trade routes, fortified cities that were true fortresses, and naturally more defensible borders. It was the rich and well-positioned side. The Western Roman Empire was the opposite, almost a poor and unlucky brother. Their capital was oscillating between Milan and Ravenna, far from the glory of Rome, and they faced a nightmare: constant invasions, crops that failed for years on end, a demographic crisis, less people being born, more people dying, and an army chronically underfunded. It was a scenario of impending disaster. While the East managed to consolidate its authority and flourish, the West was losing it day by day like sand through its fingers. The city of Rome itself, although it retained immense symbolic value, was no longer the pulsating center of imperial power. It was a shadow of its former self. The barbarians, more than invaders, they were pushed neighbors. It was in this Western Roman Empire, already weakened and divided, that the so-called barbarians found their space, their chance. But who were they really? In the Roman mentality of the time, barbarian was a convenient label, almost a pejorative term. It was a simple and lazy way of classifying all those who were outside the Greco-Roman world, who spoke strange languages, who did not follow its laws or customs. They were the other, the different, the uncivilized. But this word, barbarian, hid much more than it revealed. Because you see, the so-called barbarians were not a uniform group, much less a cultureless, primitive horde, as the popular image often suggests. Far from it, they were diverse peoples, with their own well-defined identities, complex religions, shifting alliances, and often sophisticated survival strategies. Among them, we had the Goths, who were divided into Visigoths and Ostrogoths, semi-nomadic Germanic peoples who for decades had already served as federated of the Roman army. Federates were basically allies who received land and payments to defend the Roman borders. There were also Vandals, a group that made an incredible journey, crossing Gaul and Hispania, present-day Spain, until settling in North Africa, where they formed a powerful naval fleet that would challenge Rome at sea. It had the Saxons and Franks, who expanded along the borders of the Rhine, creating kingdoms that would later become powers in Europe. And the most feared of all, those who spread terror wherever they went, the Molting, coming from the steppes of Central Asia, nomadic, fast, violent, and incredibly unpredictable. Led by legendary figures such as Attila, they were a force of nature, Roman arrogance and the invitation to chaos. The most fascinating and tragic thing is that these groups, for the most part, they didn't want to destroy Rome. On the contrary, many of them wanted to enter the empire, to share in its prosperity, to take advantage of what it offered. The security of its laws, the status of being part of a powerful civilization, perhaps even a piece of land to settle on. Some were even integrated as allies, receiving official titles such as Duke, and exercising important administrative and military functions within the empire itself. Rome used them as a shield, but treated them like dogs. Mass Roman arrogance, the same one that made them giants, made any real coexistence, any genuine integration difficult. Even when the barbarians were received as allies, they were treated with a mixture of distrust, contempt, and worse, constant betrayals. The fragile Roman diplomacy, based more on superiority than on mutual respect, would not last forever. and those people who had previously knocked on Rome's doors asking for permission or shelter soon found, or were forced to find, a way through. And when they began to enter en masse, the consequences were irreversible. Because, and this is crucial to understand, the barbarian migrations, contrary to what many still believe, were not spontaneous attacks by savage hordes. They were, in fact, the consequence of something much bigger and much more chaotic that was happening deep beneath Eurasia. Think of a giant chain reaction. They weren't just invasions, they were waves of desperation and survival. Forget that image of invasion, as if it were an army marching in a straight line to war, all planned out. The so-called barbarian invasions were something much more complex and above all desperate. Think of it as a massive displacement, a giant human wave in search of survival. We are talking about entire populations, tribes, clans, families with their women and children, all on the move. They were not there to destroy for sport. They were being pressured by gigantic forces that Rome neither controlled nor fully understood. One of the major causes of this pressure came from a distant place, from the depths of the Eurasian steppes, the arrival of Thermolting. Imagine a force of nature, nomadic horsemen as fast as the wind, so violent that their name became legend. Their mere presence on the eastern borders of Europe, especially near the majestic Danube River, sowed panic indescribable among the Germanic tribes that were already established there. People like the Visigoths and the Vandals, who already had their lands and relatively peaceful lives, fled en masse in a desperate exodus. The only way out they saw was to seek refuge in Roman territory. It was as if an uncontrollable fire was spreading, and the only hope was to jump into your neighbor's house, even if he didn't want you there and the house was falling apart. But it wasn't just external pressure. There was also internal causes that drove these migrations. Think about the shortage of fertile land in the regions of origin of these people. Where they lived, the land was no longer enough to feed everyone. Add to this the population growth theirs. More mouths to feed, fewer resources. This combination literally forced them to seek better living conditions. And surprisingly, for many of these barbarians, even with all their problems, Rome was still a beacon, a synonym for stability, wealth, and the future. Entering the empire was not an initial act of war, but an opportunity for survival and social advancement. The big and fatal problem is that Rome no longer had the structure to absorb so many people. Its borders, once insurmountable walls, were weakened by civil war and a chronic lack of resources. Public officials, those who were supposed to manage the arrival of these people, were often corrupt and incompetent. The resources to feed, settle, and integrate so many people were scarce, almost non-existent. Attempts to negotiate integration, to make coexistence agreements, failed spectacularly. Why? Because of an explosive mix of bad faith, on both sides by the way, chaotic disorganization, and, mainly, Roman prejudice deep-rooted. What could have been a relationship of cooperation and symbiosis turned into a widespread and bloody conflict. Migrations, once streams, became uncontrollable avalanche. One tribe pushed another, which pushed another, in a domino effect that swept everything in its path. Some sought peace, others plunder, and the empire, increasingly unstable and exhausted, simply I no longer had the strength to react. He was like a tired giant, unable to raise his arms to defend himself. For many centuries, Rome knew how to use the so-called barbarians to its advantage. They were strategists in this sense. Many were incorporated as federated, a kind of contract. They received land and permission to live within the empire in exchange for military support. In practice, this meant thousands of Germanic, Allan, Vandal, and Goth soldiers serving loyally under the famous Roman eagles. They were the front line, protecting the borders, patrolling the roads, and fighting Rome's common enemies, often spilling their own blood. Some of these barbarian warriors were so talented that they rose to high positions in the Roman army. Barbarian leaders were given important titles, such as dukes or counts, and came to govern entire regions, some even marrying members, of the Roman aristocracy, weaving an intricate social tapestry. Apparently, this was a functional integration, beneficial to both sides. But behind this facade of alliance and cooperation, there was a constant tension, a growing resentment that bubbled beneath the surface. The Romans, in their innate cultural arrogance, did not see them as equals. It was an invisible but impenetrable barrier. Even when these barbarians performed essential services for the survival of the empire, they were treated, with a mixture of distrust, humiliation, and palpable contempt. Promises of land and provisions were frequently broken, leaving these populations hungry and homeless. Corrupt officials demanded bribes, food was deliberately withheld, and, to make matters worse, physical abuse was committed by local governors who felt above the law, as if they were dealing with animals, not human beings. This systematic contempt and this endless series of betrayals were the seed that transformed loyal allies into fierce and determined enemies. And in the year 378 DC, this pent-up tension exploded dramatically in Battle of Adrianople. The story is sad and emblematic. The Visigoths, a people who sought refuge within the empire, were brutally mistreated by the Roman authorities. They were deceived, robbed, and humiliated. Their patience ran out, and they revolted. The emperor, brave, convinced of Roman superiority and full of arrogance, marched with his army to confront them, but with fatal imprudence. Without proper preparation and underestimating the enemy, the result was a total and humiliating annihilation. Valens, the emperor himself, died on the battlefield, and about 2/3 of his army were destroyed. This defeat was not just military, it was deeply symbolic. She shouted to the whole world and to the empire itself that the barbarians were no longer mere supporting actors in Rome's great play. They were now powerful protagonists, capable of defeating an emperor in open combat. And, most painful to Roman pride, it proved that Rome was no longer invincible. And while the Goths were etching their name in history with this crushing victory, a new, far more terrifying threat was approaching with terrifying fury and speed. A name that Rome would never forget: Attila. Attila, the scourge of God, comes for the horror show. While Rome was still trying to deal with the aftermath of the Battle of Adrianople, licking its wounds and trying to maintain the appearance of control, a new force emerged from the icy depths of the Central Asian steppes. They were wild, fast, and unpredictable. They were tumulting. To the Romans, the appearance of these nomadic horsemen seemed like a nightmare come true, a plague sent by the gods. They rode small but incredibly agile horses, which allowed them to maneuver with astonishing speed. They used compound bows capable of piercing armor from a distance, making legionaries vulnerable before they could even get close, and they fought with a brutality which destabilized even the most experienced Roman soldiers, accustomed to war. Their tactic was pure terror, psychological warfare even before physical combat. But the real terror would only begin in the year 434 DC, when a singular leader took charge and changed everything forever: Attila. He was not just a warrior, he was a military genius, a ruthless strategist, a born leader. Attila achieved the unthinkable. He unified scattered, previously warring Hun tribes, imposed iron, discipline, and a devastating combat strategy on these nomadic warriors, and transformed them into a transcontinental power. Attila was not just an exceptional military leader, he was a cunning political leader, one sagacious diplomat who knew how to extract tribute without a single battle, and a ruthless strategist who saw the battlefield as a chessboard. He knew when to negotiate with diplomacy and when to strike with overwhelming fury. His name, Scourge of God, was not a self-imposed title. It was a terrified acknowledgement by the Romans themselves and their enemies, and his name would become synonymous with destruction throughout the empire. Attila, where terror mixed with negotiation and destruction. We've already talked about Attila, the Hun leader who came out of nowhere and united scattered tribes into an unstoppable force. He was not just a brute warrior, he was a mind brilliant and frighteningly strategic. Think of a guy who was so smart that negotiated with Rome when it suited. Him, taking full advantage of a desperate empire that was paying fortunes in gold to avoid war. But at the same time, this same Attila did not hesitate to destroy entire cities when he deemed it necessary, leaving a trail of ash and despair. It was a brutal power game, where the life and death of entire populations were in their hands. Under his command, the Huns swept across the Balkans like an uncontrollable storm. They not only threatened the mighty Constantinople, the impregnable capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, as they also demanded exorbitant taxes, a fortune in gold that bled the imperial coffers dry. They left behind devastated fields and ruined villages from the Danube to the Black Sea. When Attila turned his hungry gaze to the west, chaos spread like wildfire, devouring everything in its path. Roman sources of the time could barely find words to describe the terror he inspired. So, in a desperate way, they called him Scourge of God. And it wasn't necessarily because they were religious. It was because in their minds they simply couldn't find any other explanation for such destruction and horror. How could a human being be so ruthless and overwhelming? But Attila was not done with his horror show yet. His most ambitious coup, the one that would bring the Western Roman Empire to the brink of total collapse, was yet to come. He wanted to bring down what was left of Roman pride. Rome's last card. Blood on the Catalonian fields. In the year of 451 DC, Attila, with his Hun horde, launched his most audacious offensive, the invasion of Gaul, what we now know as France. But this was much more than a simple military campaign of conquest. It was an attempt to break the backbone of the Western Roman Empire. Cities fell one after another. The inhabitants fled in panic. Terror advanced without stopping, and collapse seemed, at last, inevitable. Rome was with the noose around its neck, its last breath about to be taken. But against all odds, out of the dust and despair, one unlikely alliance came into being. Flavius Aetius, one of the last great Roman generals, and one of the few who still inspired confidence, achieved something almost impossible for the time. He raised an army, but it was not a purely Roman army, like those proud legionaries of old. It was a heterogeneous but powerful mix. Imperial soldiers, yes, but also Visigoths, those same people who, years before, had humiliated Rome at Adrianople, led by their king Theodoric I and other federated peoples. It was the Rome's last line of defense, all or nothing. The empire literally put what was left of its forces and its hope on the battlefield. The epic confrontation took place in the Catalan fields. It was one of the bloodiest and most brutal battles of all late antiquity. The ground, the chronicles say, was soaked in blood. Attila, with all his ferocity, had achieved a bittersweet feat. Theodoric, the brave Visigoth king, had died in battle, a severe blow to the alliance. And, although he was defeated and forced to retreat, Attila managed to withdraw a significant part of his forces, proving that, even wounded, he was still a threat. Rome breathed a little easier, yes, but at a terrible cost, with thousands of lives lost and the certainty that the war was not over. The Pope and the Dragon, Attila's mysterious retreat from Italy. The following year, Attila, relentless as ever, returned. This time his target was Italy, the beating heart of the empire, the very land where Rome was born. Cities like Aquileia were completely razed, turned into unrecognizable ruins. The entire peninsula was thrown into panic. Rome itself, without an army, without defenses, without hope, seemed condemned to a cruel fate. But then, something unexpected, and for many mysterious, happened. The Pope Leo I, the leader of the Catholic Church, had incredible courage. He was personally meet with Attila outside the walls of Rome. No one knows for sure what was said between them in that epic encounter. Some whisper of a divine miracle, an intervention by God that touched the heart of the fearsome Hun. Others, more pragmatic, speak of large bribes, secret political promises, or even threats of imminent plagues and famine that could ravage the Hun troops if they persisted in the siege of Rome. The truth is that, whatever the reason, the result was surprising. Attila withdrew. Rome was again forgiven, almost by a hair's breadth, saved from almost certain destruction. But this respite, this relief was all too brief. Just 2 years later, Attila himself died. Mysteriously, it is said, perhaps from a fatal nosebleed in his sleep, or even from poisoning. And his gigantic nomadic empire, which he had built with so much blood and terror, quickly fell apart, vanishing like smoke. But the damage had already been done. Rome had survived physically, it is true, but psychologically, she was already on her knees, with morale in tatters, without belief in their own invincibility. The loot that shattered a myth, the trauma of 410 AD. And the worst part is that, even before Attila threatened its gates, even before the Battle of the Catalonian fields, Rome had already been shaken by a blow that was impossible to ignore, something that would change the world's perception forever, a trauma that would haunt it. In the year 410 DC, an unthinkable event happened. The Eternal City, the one that hadn't seen invaders for almost 8 centuries, since the Gallic sack back in the distant 4th century BC, was taken. And the person responsible for this affront was not a distant and incomprehensible enemy, but a former frustrated ally, Alaric, the king of Visigoths. Consider the story of Alaric, For years, he served Rome with a loyalty that should have been rewarded. He fought bravely as a Roman general, sought fair deals for his people, demanded the payments promised to his men who served the empire. But he was signored, betrayed, and humiliated repeatedly by the Roman emperors and bureaucrats who viewed the barbarians as inferior, even when they were vital to their own defense. When he realized that the empire would never fulfill its promises, that diplomacy was a sham, Alaric made the historic, bold, and desperate decision, marched on Rome. The city at that time was no longer the administrative capital of the empire. This function was divided between Milan and Ravenna, but it remained the symbolic heart, soul, and pride of the empire. It was the mother city, untouchable. When the gates of Rome were opened, some say they were opened by hungry and revolting slaves, there was little resistance. The city was emptied of military power. 3 days, the Visigoths plundered ancient temples, wealthy mansions, treasure-filled storehouses, and grandiose monuments. It is important to note, this was not an indiscriminate killing or mass destruction like other brutal sackings that would follow, but the impact was devastating in its essence. The entire world, from Britain to faraway Persia, watched in astonishment at this news. For contemporaries, it was not just a case of plunder, it was the end of an era, the twilight of an ideal. Saint Jerome, one of the greatest Christian intellectuals of the time, wrote in horror, with a palpable sense of despair, "The world is in ruins." Alaric did not destroy Rome physically, but he did something much more profound and irrevocable. He destroyed your myth. He shattered the idea that Rome was invincible, an unassailable bastion. And the myth, the belief in the superiority and eternity of Rome, was, for many, what still sustained the empire, what gave hope and maintained order. From that moment on, the idea that Rome was untouchable shattered into 1,000 pieces, never to be the same again. The Vandals' plunder, when the sea brought more pain and wickedness, and if Alaric's Visigoths demonstrated in a shocking way that Rome could fall, the Vandals would show, a few years later, that it could be plundered again, and with even greater precision, brutality and viciousness. It was an even deeper blow to Roman morality. Just 45 years after the shock of Alaric, Rome would be sacked again. But this time, the threat would not come from the dusty roads, but from Thamar. In the year of 455 DC, Genseric, the cunning and ruthless king of the Vandals, crossed the Mediterranean with a powerful and well-equipped fleet from his base in North Africa. He landed on the Italian coast and marched directly towards the city, encountering no resistance. Rome was once again defenseless, an easy target. Its army was virtually non-existent, a shadow of its former self. The government was in shambles, as unstable as a house of cards about to collapse. To complete the scenario of misfortune, the emperor at the time had been assassinated days before, leaving a complete power vacuum, a city without a leader. There was no organized resistance. The Vandals, a surgical plunder, and an unforgettable name. There was no resistance. For 14 full days, Genseric and his Vandals carried out a methodical and surgical withdrawal. Think of the difference. Alaric's Visigoths, who came before, acted more out of frustration and urgency, taking what they could. The Vandals, led by Genseric, had a very well-drawn plan. They knew exactly what they were looking for: gold, silver, jewelry, statues, religious relics. They were like professional thieves, with a list in hand, searching every corner of the city. Even the precious ornaments of the Temple of Jerusalem, which Emperor Titus had brought to Rome centuries earlier as a war trophy, were taken by the Vandals. Imagine the historical and symbolic value of something like that, simply being taken away. Genseric also made a point of taking important hostages, like the Dowager Empress Licinia Eudoxia and their daughters. These women were of great political and symbolic value, bargaining chips for future negotiations, ensuring that the Romans, even if humiliated, still had something to lose. Once again, Rome was spared the total destruction of its physical structures from being burned or demolished, but in the end, all that was left was an empty city, plundered to the bone, stripped of her authority and her soul. She seemed like a body without a spirit. The cultural impact of this looting was so profound that centuries later the name Vandal no longer referred only to a specific people. It would become synonymous with blind, gratuitous, and savage destruction of something done for no apparent reason, just to devastate. And the most ironic thing is that although Genseric's sack was calculated, precise and with a clear objective, the collective memory immortalized him as a symbol of pure and simple devastation. It is a testament to the trauma he caused, and there is an even more symbolic detail which shows how much Rome was no longer the same. At that time, the city of Rome itself was no longer the capital of the empire. The throne, the center of political and military power, had moved to Ravenna, a coastal city that was easier to defend strategically. But even far from the center of administrative power, Rome was still the soul of the empire, the cradle of his identity and pride. And now, that soul was empty, plundered, deeply wounded. The last emperor, a name that was prophecy. We now move forward to the year 475 DC. A young figure ascended to the throne, almost by chance, a teenager with a name that seemed like a prophecy, almost a cruel irony of fate, Romulus Augustus. Think with me, Romulus as the legendary founder of Rome, the one who, according to legend, started it all and established the city. And Augustus as the first emperor, the one who inaugurated the golden age of peace and glory. But that young man would find no glory. He would be the symbol of the end, the last note of a melody that was fading away. Placed on the throne by his own father, the Roman general Germanus Orestes, Romulus was merely a figurehead, a puppet in his father's hands. He was emperor without real power, a mere puppet in an empire that no longer had armies worthy of the name, nor authority over vast regions of its own territory. He ruled from Ravenna, isolated from historic Rome, with very little influence and no solid support among the factions that disputed power. It was a reign of facade, a melancholy spectacle, the ultimate farce. The following year, the inevitable happened. Odoacro, a leader of the barbarian troops, yes, them again. These mixed troops, made up of different Germanic peoples, were what was left of Rome's army, who served in the Roman army, made a demand that would seal the empire's fate, land in Italy for his men. Orestes, Romulus's father, and the real power behind the throne, refused. Odoacer responded with the strength that Orestes did not have. He marched on Ravenna, defeating the small and demoralized imperial forces and deposing Romulus Augustus, almost bloodless. It was an anticlimactic end to such a grand story. The young emperor was spared, exiled with a modest pension to live in a comfortable villa, and simply disappeared from history, leaving no significant trace. The end without epic battles, a whisper, not a scream. But the gesture that followed the overthrow of Romulus Augustulus was the one that sealed the fate, the final point. Odoacer, shrewd and without the ambition to wear a tarnished crown, instead of proclaiming himself emperor, did something unprecedented. He sent the imperial insignia, the crown, the mantle, the scepter, all sacred symbols of Rome's power, to Constantinople, the vibrant capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. And along with them, a clear message, a message for history. There was no longer any need for an emperor in the West. The throne was vacant and would remain so. There was no epic final battle, no breathtaking heroic clash, no glorious last stand. The greatest empire in Western history, the one that seemed eternal, that inspired generations, ended in a silent, almost in a whisper, not with a battle cry, but with the surrender of a symbol. It was dismantled from within, corroded by decades of neglect, arrogance, and a relentless decay that emptied it of its essence. On the day, September 4th, 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire had officially fallen. An end to the old era, and a starting point for a new world. An end that was a beginning, the legacy of immortal Rome. But the fall of Rome was not just an end. It was also, paradoxically, a start. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD did not mean the total extinction of Roman culture, nor the disappearance of its influence. Far from it, it's with him which still influence our legal codes. Their language, Latin, the basis of many modern languages, its monumental architecture present in buildings throughout Europe, and even its religion, Christianity, which Rome had embraced and spread, lived on. They did not die. They were absorbed, reinvented, and transmitted by the new kingdoms and new leaders that arose on the ruins of the empire. It was a process of gradual transformation, not of instant annihilation. Meanwhile, the Roman East, which we know as Byzantine Empire, would resist for almost 1,000 more years, keeping alive the flame of Roman culture and scholarship, serving as a bridge to Western Europe. But in the West, what remained were fragments of a past greatness, grand cathedrals built with stones and columns taken from ancient pagan temples, Germanic kings who, even with their own laws and customs, used Roman titles to legitimize their power, devoted monks who in their isolated monasteries meticulously copied and preserved the manuscripts of classical authors, saving knowledge from oblivion. The medieval world that emerged from the ashes of Rome was indeed very different, more decentralized, more rural, more unstable, and with a distinct social system. But at its foundation, in its deepest structure, in its DNA, was Rome. In every law that was written, in every word of vulgar Latin that evolved into our Romance languages, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, French, in every vision of imperial power, Rome continued whispering. His legacy was and still is immense, an eternal echo that shaped the West.